following the lecture and the question and answer conversation, we will have a dessert reception in the dining room to follow. So everyone here is invited. Just a little insider information from the Harvey Lecture Committee. The students invited the Reverend Dr. Brad Hauff because we desired for the Indigenous voice to be heard on our campus. Today, we had the opportunity to hear the good news, albeit challenging news, on an accurate portrayal of Indigenous history. Right now, our Dean and President, Cynthia Kittredge, is going to tell us more about our speaker.
Good evening and welcome again. Before I introduce Dr. Hauff, I want to say something briefly about the Harvey Lecture at Seminary of the Southwest. The Harvey Lecture is named for Dean Hudnall Harvey, former dean of the seminary, and was created by his family after his death to honor him. And it's a lecture organized by students. The speaker is chosen by students, and students organize the whole event. And we're very grateful to Lisa Lewis and the others on the committee who invited Dr. Hauff and have organized this evening. So thank you very much. Our speaker tonight is the Reverend Dr. Bradley S. Hauff, the Indigenous Missioner for the Episcopal Church and a member of the presiding bishop's staff. Dr. Hauff is originally from South Dakota, born in Sioux Falls and raised in Rapid City, and he is enrolled with the Oglala Sioux tribe, the Lakota of Pine Ridge, as were both of his parents, who were both survivors of Indigenous boarding schools. South Dakota, Minnesota, Florida, and Pennsylvania. He is the author of articles and made numerous presentations around the country on Native American issues. Thank you for preaching this morning and for introducing us to your thinking and your bio, and we look forward to hearing from you tonight. The Reverend Dr. Bradley S. Hauff.
Lamia, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to begin with a prayer. And this is a prayer in the Lakota language, and it's the doxology. Many of us in the Dakotas, when we gather, we pray this prayer on a number of occasions and in different settings. So let us pray. Atea pichihintuki, nawonia wakanki he. Wakantanka wajina ki, he woita yuha nuwe. Amen. I want to greet you with Lakota words. Earlier today, we, at the sermon, at the Eucharist, I taught you all how to say good day in Lakota, those of you who were there. Ampe tu washte. Hope you remember that. I'd like to use another greeting as we start off this evening. How matakiepi. And I wonder if you could repeat after me, and we'll do it word by word as we did this morning. The first word is how. Hey, you're pretty good. You sure you're not Lakota? That was very nice. Second one is kind of more difficult. Mitakuyepi. Good, that's a good one. Now all together, how mutakiepi. Wonderful. That means hello, relatives. Hello, relatives. And what it does is it teaches, in just those two words, the Lakota and indigenous Weltanschauung or worldview that we are all related. We are all a part of a spiritual, universal ecosystem of relationship. all things are related, and we're a part of that. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that later on in the presentation. But Haumutaki, hello, my relatives. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to start out by apologizing for using the word ain't. Those of you who are on the grammar police, my apologies. I just thought it would sound a little better. It sounds a little better to say it ain't easy being native. Indigenous people, the doctrine of discovery, and the Episcopal Church. I'm so glad to be able to present this to you. It never ceases to amaze me how many people have still never heard of the doctrine of discovery. And those who have, some of them don't know what it is. So I'd like to include a clear explanation of the doctrine of discovery in my presentation so everybody has an understanding of what it is and its effect on indigenous people for centuries to the present day. You've heard me use the word indigenous, and I will use that throughout this presentation to describe indigenous people. And I do that using the United Nations definition of indigenous. This comes from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is communities, peoples, and nations which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. That's a long definition, isn't it? It reads like one of Paul's letters. Basically, what it means is people who have been colonized. People who have been colonized by other nations. There are indigenous people all over the world. Even in Europe, the Sami people up by the Arctic Circle in extreme northern Scandinavia are Caucasian, but they are considered indigenous because they have been colonized by the nations of Finland and Sweden. So that's our understanding. It's not just people who've lived in a certain area for a long time, but usually that is the case with people who've been colonized. But the colonization element is essential to the understanding of this. Now, we don't really refer to ourselves as indigenous people so much. There are a number of different terms that are used. The term Indian is still commonly used. And we're not offended by that term, not insulted at all. We use it ourselves and refer to one another as such. There are a number of our organizations that still use that word in the title. The North Dakota Council on Indian Ministries, for example, or the Minnesota Committee on Indian Work are two prominent councils in the Episcopal Church in indigenous territories, and they make use of the word Indian. So we're okay with Indian. Native American, not so much, because it includes the word America in it. And that's a reminder of our colonization, that we're colonized people. And we don't need to be reminded of that. We feel it every day. Same with the term American Indian. The ideal way to refer to an indigenous person is by their tribe, their tribal membership. So for me, it would be Oglala or Oglala Sioux. Oglala is a word that means the scattered people. The scattered people. Not the scatterbrained people. Although in my case, maybe that holds true sometimes. But the scattered people. Or our language, which is called Lakota, we sometimes use that as an identification as well. Oglala, Lakota. If the person knows their clan or some of their family names, that would be another way of identifying themselves. I unfortunately don't know that. My family was anglicized quite early, in the middle to late 19th century. The last indigenous family name that my family knows is Wambli Tashunka, Wambli Tashunka, which means eagle horse. And my father's great-great-grandmother was Tinglishka, which means spotted fawn. But after that, we were anglicized and given and taken European names largely through intermarriage. And that is the way it is with most indigenous people. There are very few of us who are full-blooded. Very few of us who speak the language fluently. Most of us don't live on reservations or land trusts. We live in urban metropolitan areas. Over 80% of us do. We're all over the United States. Even though people may not see us or recognize us as indigenous, we're here. But I'm using that term because it's universal and it applies across the board. Indigenous and Judeo-Christian American worldviews. I'd like to address that. There are hundreds of indigenous tribes on Turtle Island or North America. In what is currently known as the United States alone, there are over 570. Tribes have different languages, traditions, creation myths, and social practices. There are some perspectives that are held in common, however. And that hide there is a replication of Powhatan's mantle from Jamestown. The original mantle is in a museum in England right now, and that's a replica of it. So, first of all, indigenous worldviews and religions are inextricably grounded in the natural world. The earth, geology and geography, weather, plant and animal life. The natural world is centrally featured in creation stories and myths, and the societal archetypes and ethics are based on it. Judeo-Christian worldviews, on the other hand, tend to be grounded in special revelation or scriptures, doctrines and dogmas, or narratives of some kind. Not that the natural world isn't found in the Judeo-Christian traditions and teachings. It is. It just doesn't have the prominent place that scriptures do. If you were to ask someone coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, what is the way of God, or how do we know the ways of God, they probably would say, open up the Bible and start reading. If you were to ask the same question of an indigenous person, how would you know the ways of the Spirit? They would say, go outside and observe. What do you see? Look at the trees and the plants and the weather. Look at the animals. What are they doing? Those are the ways of the Spirit. So grounded in the natural world, much more than the Judeo-Christian tradition is. Indigenous worldviews and religions do not recognize a dichotomy of material and spiritual facets of life. Everything is spiritual. Everything is alive. I said earlier that we live in a universe that is a spiritual ecosystem within which we are all related. And that manifests itself physically, but it is spiritual in nature and alive. Christianity tends to teach that there is a dichotomy, and what is material is inferior to what is spiritual. Seek that which is spiritual in your life and not the material things. Because everyone and everything is spiritual in nature, there is also no dichotomy of sacred and secular in indigenous worldviews. Everything is sacred. Indigenous people would say, well, if God created everything, all that is, or everything, all that is, goes back to something that God created, how could it not be sacred? Who says it's secular? What determines that? Christianity teaches such a dichotomy, and separation of church and state is a basic principle in American government and society. In politics, on reservations and among tribes, people who are running for office, tribal office, very openly talk about their spiritual lives when they're campaigning, and they consider that to help qualify them to serve in office. if they are a balanced person spiritually who's living in relational harmony with all of creation and the Great Spirit. That is held up as uniquely qualifying someone for public service. You wouldn't see that in the dominant American society, would you? Indigenous worldviews see everything the cosmos as equal and related, as I said. We are all relatives: people, animals, plants, rocks, stars, and planets, the weather, etc. Nothing is disconnected from anyone or anything else. Plants and animals are typically referred to as people. I have several trees in my yard at home, and I call them my tree people, and I have names for them. And they're pretty smart. They're pretty smart because I live in Minnesota and Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's cold up there in the wintertime. You go outside and you stay out there too long, you could freeze to death. And we have to wear jackets and heavy coats and not stay out for very long. Well, my tree people, they don't wear anything, and they survive. They know how to do it. They know how to do things that I can't do. So I have great respect for that. Christianity does really not teach that, on the other hand, and furthermore teaches that there is a hierarchy in life, with humans at the top because they are made in God's image. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, humans are entrusted with dominion over the rest of creation. Indigenous worldviews and religions do not teach human dominance. We are seen as having a place in the universe, a place in the world that the Great Spirit has given to us. We are to know that place and stay in it. And by doing so, we honor the Great Spirit and give thanks appropriately. But what do we see in other societies? And it really does seem to be encouraged by the Judeo-Christian principle that God has given humans dominion over the earth and all of the creation of the earth and the animals and plants. Now, we can interpret that in different ways, I suppose. But indigenous worldviews do not recognize that at all. And we see what is happening all around us in the world when humans have transgressed that boundary, gone beyond their space and asserted their dominance. And what are the results of that? Well, indigenous people see all of creation as being out of balance when that happens. It has a systemic effect on the whole ecosystem. And so we see things like pollution and climate change and the funky weather that we've been getting lately. Our planet is in danger, seriously, probably more than we can think or know. And indigenous people believe it's because humans have asserted their dominance and seen creation as their possession to use according to their pleasure and benefit. The indigenous worldviews and religions do not see anything fundamentally wrong with people. There is no concept of original sin. Indigenous worldviews and religions recognize good and bad behavior with resulting consequences and values and ideals as well, but there is no intrinsic sin within people that needs to be atoned for or forgiven, which is very central to the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, not that the Judeo-Christian worldview does not teach the goodness of people made in the image of God. It does. It's not like it's not there at all. But there is an emphasis on sin, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And Christianity is really based on the foundation that humankind needs a Savior. Our sin needs to be atoned for. Indigenous people have a real difficulty understanding that. It seems so contrary to our worldview and our life. So Christianity tends to be sin-based, whereas indigenous worldviews and religions are virtues-based. Again, not that virtues aren't found in Christianity, they are. There just isn't as much of an emphasis on them as there is on sin. And of course, this is in proportion to the denomination or the church. Some churches don't put so much emphasis on sin, and I like to think that we are part of one in the Episcopal Church. Indigenous religion is centered in and practiced within the community as a whole and not in a separate institution, unlike the Christian church. So people did not go to church like they were going someplace else other than where they lived. Instead, spiritual ceremonies were a part of ordinary community and tribal life. While there were and are shamans, prophets, and elders, they have lived and practiced within the community and have not been organized separately or in any hierarchical way. If you were to go to an indigenous community and look for the medicine man, the Wishashawaka, or if you were to look for an elder to talk to, you would not necessarily recognize them by sight. And they wouldn't have an office that they would keep that you would go to, or a building. You'd go visit them at home, and they would look just like anybody else. You really would have to live within the community for a while to get to know the people and figure out who are the elders here, because they are not going to self-identify. So these are some of the primary characteristics of the indigenous worldview, in contrast to what we see in the dominant society of American culture and within the church. There are some others as well. This is a photograph of Dakota Goodhouse teaching at the Native Youth event on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North Dakota at Camp Gabriel. He was up there several years ago and gave a really great lesson to the young people. There he is, Dakota Goodhouse. Very talented flute player as well. Many, actually most, all the ones that I know, indigenous communities, were matriarchal in their organization, with females being the heads of households. I mentioned that a little bit during the sermon today. Women were in charge of the community and the households. They made them run. They were the organizers. They were the authority. Men were not. Men were more outside of the community, doing the hunting and gathering, and they were the warriors, protecting the villages for the most part. But when they would come home, they were not in charge. The women were in charge, and the men answered to them. And that is why I said earlier that our elders have taught us that at that time there was no domestic abuse or violence within indigenous communities. It just didn't happen. And of course, after colonization, when indigenous women were stripped of their role and their authority and their power, that's when domestic abuse and violence escalated within indigenous communities to the point where it is now the highest than any other group in proportion to the population. It's one of the tragedies of colonization. People lived in the present immediate state. In some indigenous languages, there is no past or future tense, just present, living in the here and now, because the here and now is eternity, and that's how the Great Spirit lives. So if an indigenous person is going to go fishing, say, for example, maybe tomorrow or next week, maybe next month, he or she will merely say, "I'm going fishing." Could be today, could be tomorrow, could be next week. It's not clarified. You just wait and see what happens. Now, the interesting thing about this is when the early missionaries came to the indigenous communities, especially from the Roman Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church, and started teaching the theology of the Eucharist, the anamnesis, the part during the Eucharistic prayer where we enter into a timeless state of eternity with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven coming together and sharing that same spiritual space at the Eucharistic table. Indigenous people understood that instantly. They knew exactly what that was. They probably understood it more than most Christians did, because that's how they lived. So the anamnesis made perfect sense to them. This is a practical concern. A direct eye contact is inappropriate for indigenous people. It is seen as rude, even hostile. And that's one of the tragedies of colonization, is that one of the things that indigenous children were taught in the boarding schools when they were being assimilated was to make and maintain direct eye contact, especially with the teachers and the principals. And if they didn't do that, it was punished, because the student was seen as being dishonest or hiding something, maybe feeling guilty for having done something wrong, holding back, and they were punished for that. In reality, the indigenous students were just being respectful, because that's what it's all about. You don't look somebody directly in the eye out of respect for them. You allow them their space. You allow them their comfort. To look them directly in the eyes to be confrontational. So there are only two reasons that an indigenous person would look somebody directly in the eye in the traditional culture, and that's if they wanted to fight them or if they wanted to engage in amorous relations. So can you imagine how frustrating it was to have to make that change? It felt doing something so contrary to what is right. But that's just one example of what happened during the assimilation process. And because the earth is seen as a relative, the ownership of land or exclusive ownership of anything is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. The earth doesn't belong to anyone. And in our society, we look at land, and what is land? Well, land is something that's owned by somebody who has their name on a deed in a file cabinet down at the courthouse. That's what land is. Indigenous people have never seen it that way. And when you think about it, no one really owns anything, do we? I mean, we have it for a while, but we can't take it with us. And eventually it's passed on to somebody else. This earth that's been around for billions of years, God willing, will still be around billions of years from now. We might not be, but it'll still be here. So we didn't really own it at all. So indigenous people still have difficulty understanding what that is all about. Family, and in particular the extended family, is a priority over individual success or achievement. In my tribe, the extended family is called the Tioshbe. The Tioshbe, and that is not just a nuclear family and uncles and cousins, but going back, expanding it out to second cousins and third cousins, all living together as family and regarding one another as family. So uncles are considered to be fathers, and aunties are considered to be mothers. Cousins are considered to be siblings. And anybody who's in the same tribe that you can't find a direct blood relationship to in any way, then they're your cousins. They're your cousins. So there's a whole extended family system that's there that was the teacher of the culture and the language, and it provided support. That is why indigenous people, by and large, are not really successful, at least materially, professionally, and in their careers. Because if a person really wants to be successful and eventually get a top position or make a lot of money, what is one of the things they have to do? They have to be willing to spend time away from their family. They have to be willing to move, to relocate, sometimes on the other side of the country or some other place in the world. And there are rewards for doing that, for making that sacrifice, no doubt. But to indigenous people, that's just so unthinkable, so contrary to our culture and our sense of what is right. You don't move away from your family. Your family needs you and you need them. You can imagine how devastating it was when indigenous children were taken from their tioshbe, their extended family context, and placed in boarding schools, some of them thousands of miles away from their homes. That was probably the worst thing that could have been done to an indigenous child, worse than death. Because when a person dies, we believe that they go live with their ancestors, and they're not alone. But to be taken away from your tioshbe and taken someplace that's completely foreign, there's nothing worse than that for an indigenous child. Elders are given the utmost respect and preferential treatment in all things. At least that's in accordance with the traditional culture. Now, what we are seeing tragically in indigenous communities is elder abuse. And like domestic abuse, elder abuse never happened in the traditional culture. It is a result of colonization because it's directly related to people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, who need money, and know that one of the ways that they can get money is to go to grandma's house and take it from her, steal it from her, or steal grandma's medications out of her medicine chest, or take grandpa's television and hawk it for money to buy drugs. We're seeing a lot of that in indigenous communities, tragically. Again, as a result of colonization. That was never a part of our traditional culture. It was quite contrary to it. Indigenous cultures do not recognize binary gender classifications. There are either at least 3 genders or no word for gender at all in indigenous languages. Binary gender classifications were inflicted on us by the general population when we were assimilated. It was never the way that we understood human identity and the roles that people live out within the community. In my tribe, we had 3 gender classifications. There was the male and the female, and then the Winkte. And the Winkte were people who chose to live of the other gender than they were born. The Winkte were respected. They were never maligned or persecuted. They were not seen as a deviation from the norm, at least not in a way that was negative. They were seen as having special powers, very spiritual and very holy, and they had a very high place in the community. The Winkte did. Some tribes have more than 3 gender classifications. And in some tribes, there is no word for any gender at all. The way that you know who someone is by their dialect, how they speak. So what we would consider to be a male would speak in a certain dialect, and someone who would be considered to be female would speak in a different dialect. And the Winkte would speak in an entirely different dialect. Same language, different dialect. And that's how they were identified, through spoken language. Can you imagine how devastating it was to Two-Spirited or Winkte indigenous people who did not fit into the binary gender classifications, to have that imposed, to have that inflicted upon them? To be told that you now have to live as someone that you're not. And we still see that today in our society, don't we? It's sadly a controversial issue. Nobody should have to live as someone that they're not. Well, that gives you an example of some of the traditional indigenous worldview and culture. There's a lot more I could say about it, but we don't have all the time for that this evening. Now let's take a look at the post-Columbian world, because colonization changed everything for indigenous people. Everything. And where did it all begin? It began in the church. It began in that beloved institution that we know and love, the church, with the doctrine of discovery. Now, the doctrine of discovery are a series of papal decrees or bulls calling for the colonization of Africa and the Western Hemisphere, the taking of land, and the subjugation and religious indoctrination of the indigenous people in those regions. And what you're seeing there is an image of a papal bull or a papal decree, a statement issued out of the office of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And it's called a bull because the seal of the Pope hanging there from the document was called a bulla. A bulla. So these are papal bulls. And the first one, well, actually, the result of these papal bulls was genocide. Genocide. The church played a role in committing genocide. And it happened right here in our own backyard. We like to think of genocide as something that other nations do, other groups and organizations of people do. Evil empires, evil dictators, etc. But we don't like to look at ourselves, do we? We don't like to look at our ancestors. We don't like to look at our church as having done the same thing. But we did. A genocide was intentionally and systematically implemented on the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere from 1492 to 1890. I use the year 1890 because that's the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre. This is a quote from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. If you have not read that book, I strongly encourage you to do so. Nearly all the population areas of the Americas were reduced by 90% following the onset of colonizing projects, decreasing the targeted indigenous populations of the Americas from 100 million to 10 million, commonly referred to as the most extreme demographic disaster framed as natural in human history. The Holocaust of World War II, as awful as that was, this was far worse, more devastating, longer lasting, more intentionally implemented. Initiated by European invaders in North America and continued by the U.S. government and churches through assimilation processes, namely the boarding schools. Now, there are numerous genocidal tactics or ways of making a people disappear, and I'll talk about that later. The first papal bull that was issued by the Pope, the Dum Diversas, issued in 1452, shortly thereafter followed by the Romanus Pontifex, 1454. So the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex were papal bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Afonso V of Portugal, confirming to the crown of Portugal dominion, as a human dominance, dominion over lands in Africa. Along with encouraging the seizure of the lands of Saracen Turks and non-Christians, they granted permission for the enslavement of such peoples. So in these two papal bulls, these decrees, the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex, lay the theological and political foundations for African slavery. It came out of the church. Here's a quote from the Dum Diversas. We, the Pope, grant you, King Afonso, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. So the Pope, who is at that time certainly the most powerful and influential person on the face of the planet, is granting permission and blessing to the King of Portugal to go forth and colonize. Very shortly after Columbus's first voyage, when the Western Hemisphere was quote unquote discovered, Pope Alexander VI issued the Inter Cetera, in which he authorizes Spain as well as Portugal, to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects, and this was the first use of that term. So this decree asserted the rights of Spain now and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave discovered Africans as well. So Africa and now the Western Hemisphere. You may have heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, in which papal authority endorsed Spain and Portugal's extension of their states into the newly discovered Western Hemisphere. This treaty divided the Western Hemisphere, as it was known at the time, between Spain and Portugal. They just decided to take it. The Western Hemisphere from what is currently Greenland all the way down to Brazil now belongs to Spain and Portugal. Why? Because the Pope said so. Now, you may think, well, how ridiculous is that? And it is. How outrageous is it? And that these are old documents that certainly don't have any bearing anymore. Nobody takes them seriously. Well, the Treaty of Tordesillas was actually invoked in 1982 during the Falkland Islands War. Argentina tried to use it to justify their right to the Falkland Islands as a colony of Spain. Didn't work, but they tried it because they recognized this as something that perhaps was still valid according to international law. So these are still very much on the table, all of these documents that I'm presenting to you. So it started in Portugal, then it went to Spain, and then it went to England. King Henry VII granted a patent to John Cabot and his sons, and by this public document, Henry VII indicated his official royal support for Cabot's enterprise. As an agent of the English crown, Cabot was empowered to investigate, claim, and possess lands which before this time were unknown to all Christians, which meant he could not intrude on Spanish and Portuguese discoveries. The king would receive 1/5 of the value of merchandise brought back to Bristol, though he had invested no money of his own. So now it's in England, this discovery philosophy. And it spread throughout Europe to other nations. It allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous peoples with the justification of discovery, beginning in 1606. And what happened in 1607? The Jamestown colony in what is now known as Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. So it's in England, and then it comes across the Atlantic to the United States. In 1792, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, declared that the discovery philosophy would extend from Europe to the infant U.S. government. The doctrine and its legacy began to influence American imperialism and the treatment of indigenous peoples. So Jefferson liked the doctrine of discovery. And you know, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he makes reference to indigenous people in the Declaration of Independence. And what does he say about them? He says that they are merciless Indian savages who would be specifically excluded from the principles of freedom and human rights declared in the document. That supposedly applied to all men, all other humans, but not to the merciless Indian savages. And where's Jefferson now? Well, he's on the $2 bill. There is a memorial to him in Washington, D.C. He's on Mount Rushmore, and he's seen as one of our greatest presidents and founders. In the 19th century, in the United States, the doctrine of discovery was specifically used conceptually in the debate of public international law, expounded by the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. You might remember that from history. That's the Supreme Court ruling that basically said that indigenous tribes have no right to their land. They have no right to live there. And in this ruling, Marshall said that the right of discovery was well illustrated by the royal commission that England's King Henry VII gave to John Cabot and his sons. That commission instructed the Cabots to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, and provinces of the heathens and infidels that before this time had been unknown to all Christian people. And the U.S. Supreme Court called this claim a right of domination. So now it's here in the United States. It's in our Supreme Court. Now, interesting, Marshall flip-flopped a few years later. I don't know why he did. I've been researching that and haven't been able to find the justification or reason for it. But in 1832, the case of Worcester versus Georgia, a marshal changed his mind on the issue of indigenous tribal rights to land and ruled in favor of several southeastern U.S. native tribes, that the U.S. must establish relations with them as sovereign nations. That's a complete 180 from Johnson versus McIntosh. And the tribes were very glad to hear this news. It was a great celebration. They thought that they would be able to retain rights to their land and live there. But what happened was that the president at the time, Andrew Jackson, refused to support or enforce this decision. In fact, he defied it even though it was a Supreme Court ruling. The quote that's attributed to him is, "The Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it." This was Andrew Jackson, another person who's considered to be one of our great presidents. He's on the $20 bill, isn't he? Every time you open your wallet or purse and get out a $20 bill, there's his face. Someone who committed genocide. The result of Jackson's refusal to support Worcester versus Georgia was the Trail of Tears, the enforced deportation of indigenous tribes in the southeast to Oklahoma, the death march that they had to make, with unknown thousands dying along the way, men, women, and children. Well, this was all seen as a good thing in the United States. And a newspaper editor came up with a term for it called manifest destiny. And it expressed the philosophy that drove the 19th century U.S. territorial expansion. Manifest destiny held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. It was seen as a good thing. It was seen as the Lord's work, the right thing to do. Manifest destiny is the American doctrine of discovery. And it's been illustrated in a number of ways through art coming out of the mid to late 19th century and beyond. Here's one example of that. This is a painting by the American artist John Gast, and it's called American Progress. American Progress. You take a look at that painting and those images, and what do you see? You see a beautiful white woman in the center, kind of scantily clad, carrying a book that looks like it's an authoritative book of some kind. Maybe it's the Bible. Holding a spool of telegraph wire, moving from east to west. And in the east, there's bright sky. And you can see stagecoaches, you can see railroads, you can see ships in the background, prospectors and farmers moving from the east to the west. And what do you see in the west? You see dark clouds, storms, and you can't see it too clearly because of the darkness, but you can see the images of indigenous people and the bison fleeing for their lives going west. American progress, and it was seen as a good thing. So colonization destroyed the pre-Columbian worldview through genocide, land theft, forced cultural assimilation, the prohibition of indigenous languages, religious indoctrination, depiction of indigenous people as obsolete, and depiction of the perpetrators as good guys, not as evil dictators and perpetrators of genocide, but as good guys doing the Lord's work. And are still seen that way today, to the present day. And the result was just devastating. Before 1492, the indigenous population of what is now known as the United States is estimated to have been somewhere between 10 million and 50 million or more than that. We don't really know. Anthropologists estimate what it might have been based on what the estimated population was on other continents at the same time. But what we do know is that in 1890, the indigenous population in what is now known as the United States was recorded at 249,000. It was almost annihilated completely. And that's what genocide looks like statistically. There are different ways of making genocide happen. One way of doing it is just by killing the people. And that happened. This is Lakota artist Oscar Howe's depiction of Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. But there was a problem with killing people. Does anybody want to guess what it was? Besides that it's wrong to kill somebody. It was expensive. It was too expensive to do it. It cost a lot of money to kill people, to hire an army and train them and send them out there. Feed and clothe them, give them ammunition, knowing that some of them were going to die in the process. So a much less expensive alternative was discovered or found. Enforced assimilation of indigenous children, child removal from their indigenous extended family, the Teoshbes, into boarding schools where they would be taught how to live as white people, essentially, in the dominant American society. The motto for doing this was kill the Indian in order to save the man. That was one of the mottos of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and this is a photo of the Carlisle student body at the time that it was operating between 1879 and 1918 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Those are indigenous children from all over the United States, including Alaska, who were sent there. And all that's left of that school on that location is the Indian Cemetery, where the remains of indigenous children who died while at Carlisle were buried. They were not allowed to go home to sleep with their ancestors and be with their families anymore. They stayed where they were taken to. So they have not made their journey fully yet. Their boarding school experience continues because they're still at boarding school. They haven't gone home. But this is what the cemetery looks like. I took these photos several years ago when I visited. And the names of the names of the indigenous children who are buried there are listed on the tombstones, the names and the tribal affiliations. And some of them are just marked unknown. And I think that's a very moving and at the same time sadly accurate statement there as it pertains to indigenous people, because since we've been assimilated, so many of us, we don't even know who we are anymore. What does it mean to be an indigenous person living in the 21st century United States of America? We're not really sure what that's about. We're discovering it each day. Our understanding of who we are fundamentally was taken from us. Here's a photo before and after, a shot of the assimilation process at work. Before Carlisle and then after. You can see the transformation. Now, most of the boarding schools were operated by the federal government, but churches operated them as well. Every church, every Christian denomination that had a presence in the United States in the late 19th century operated at least one indigenous boarding school where indigenous children were assimilated forcibly into Christianity and the dominant American culture. The Episcopal Church operated at least 8 of them that we know of. We're just now starting the process of investigating our role in all of that. So there's a lot we don't know. We're just coming to a time of reckoning about it. Most of the Episcopal boarding schools closed before 1920, because that's when government funding was cut off to all the sectarian churches, and so the churches had to raise their own funds to operate, and the Episcopal Church couldn't do that anymore. So most of the schools closed. The Roman Catholic Church was in a better position to do that. They had the funds, and so almost all of the church-operated indigenous boarding schools after the 1920s were operated by the Roman Catholic Church, all the way into the 1960s and 70s. My parents were boarding school survivors. My father was raised at the federal boarding school in Pine Ridge, the Oglala Community School. He was taken there at age 5 and lived there until he was 18 and graduated. So most of his childhood and all of his adolescence, he lived at the boarding school, apart from his family. My mother was raised in an Episcopal boarding school, St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian Girls in Springfield, South Dakota. A little different kind of experience than the federal school. The federal schools were more severe, but still an instrument of assimilation. At the top there is a photo of the old St. Mary's administration building. All the buildings are gone now. For many decades they've been gone. But that's what it looked like. And at the bottom, 2 photos of my dad. He's the little boy over on the far left. That was just before he was taken to, about a year or 2 before he was taken to the boarding school. And those are his brothers to his left. And they both were boarding school students. And that was on a rare visit home. And the home where they lived is in the distance, if you can see that. This looks like a little shack there, but that's where they lived, on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And over to the right, that's my dad when he was 17 or 18 years old, after he had lived at the boarding school all those years. And there he is when he graduated, class of 1949. That's the Oglala Community High School, boarding school. Those are the students that made it through. My dad's in the center there. Look at them. Don't they look all shined up and pretty? Ready to go out into the world and make a success of themselves? That was the objective all along. That was the objective. It didn't work. Most of the people pictured there stayed in Pine Ridge, where there were no opportunities for work, and they lived out their lives in poverty and died at young ages, relatively speaking. My dad was fortunate enough to live to the age of 90. He outlived everybody in that photo. Well, the good news is that the Episcopal Church repudiated the doctrine of discovery in 2009. Many Christian denominations have done so since then. I don't believe the Roman Catholic Church has officially done that. I heard a Jesuit priest tell me that the Roman Church rescinded it. But there's a difference between rescinding and repudiating. But most Christian denominations have done so. It took long enough to do that. Today, however, the doctrine of discovery remains unknown to most Americans, and alternative views of history have been vigorously attacked. People in this country love their traditional American narrative, the Columbus discovery manifest destiny narrative, the one that teaches human dominance and that we're the greatest nation on earth. They love that narrative and they don't want it messed with. And they don't want to hear any alternative views. It's seen as anti-American propaganda and extremist. That's what we've come to in this country. But I guess, as I said in my sermon this morning, we have to be about truth-telling. We can't be about promulgating a a narrative that's mythological and has no facts to it or distorted facts. As Christians, we know that we need to know the truth, and the truth will set us free. And that's how we begin to come to terms with our role as a church in this assimilation process, this genocidal process. It's not too late to do something about it, because the effects of it are still happening. Indigenous people all over the world and here in the United States still experience them every day. It's very real. It's our life. It's not just a chapter in the history books. So I think we've got, what's it, 7:32 at this point? Do we want to take a break, or do we want to keep going? You want to keep going? You don't want to take a break? Okay, questions and answers. Okay, what I'd like to do before we go into questions and answers, I just want to show you a 2-minute video. So I'm going to have to close out of this. We were kind of experimenting with this earlier, and hopefully it'll work. Closed out. Some of you might have seen this before. These are photographs of the indigenous boarding schools that were operated by the Episcopal Church. Those photos were taken from the archives of the Diocese of South Dakota at Augustana University. Really, we're just at the early stages right now, as I said, of investigating the Episcopal Church's role in our operating boarding schools. And I'm so grateful that Executive Council and General Convention have supported this work, and that they didn't put a timeline or an ending date for it to be completed, because they see this as something that really needs to be ongoing. It's going to take time. And it only makes sense because, as I said earlier, the Episcopal boarding schools, most of them closed by 1920. It wasn't until 2021, 100 years later, that the leadership of our denomination finally acknowledged publicly that we operated these schools and what a devastating effect they had on indigenous people. It took 100 years for us to get to that point. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's going to take time. We're going to have a question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Hauff. We really appreciate the message that we get to go share. Right now, we're going to have our question and answer conversation with Dr. Stephen Tomlinson. Stephen Tomlinson is the Seminary of the Southwest Associate Professor of Leadership and Administration. We will continue until about 15 minutes, and then at 5 till 8, we will be dismissed to our reception.
Thank you so much for bringing us this history, these stories, these images. I want to start by seeing what questions are in the community here, things that you would like to hear Brad say more about. Yes, please.
What can we do? How do we push that forward? One little bit at a time, knowing that it's taken over 400 years for us to get to this point. We're still going to be dealing with this 400 years from now, assuming that humans are still around. I don't know that we will be. But it starts by telling the truth, telling the story of indigenous people and acknowledging what happened, because for so long that wasn't done. That wasn't done at all. And that's the whole purpose for land acknowledgements. General Convention passed a resolution calling for land acknowledgements to be done at all Episcopal Church gatherings. And I hope that will eventually happen, because what that does is it gets people talking about the indigenous people who used to live on the land that they now occupy. So that the land that our church is built on, the land where our diocese exists, the land where I live, my home and my backyard, was once the home of an indigenous tribe. And they're gone now. But we just want to say their name, acknowledge them, and acknowledge what happened. Because what happened just isn't a thing of the past. Its effects are still being felt today. And those are the things that we can respond to. How are indigenous people still impacted by colonization? We are. We're suffering from the effects. And how can people in the dominant society be allies for indigenous people in their struggle? It's something that we really need to take a look at how we can effectively do that. And there's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. And I could get into that if you're interested a little bit.
Let's do. And
yeah.
I think one of the students asked me a question in response to something you'd said earlier. Where do you see works of justice, small or big, that seem model or inspiring to you?
Well, to begin with, indigenous people, we're not asking that you move out of your homes and go back to Europe or wherever you lived before you came to the United States. That's not what we're asking. We're not even thinking about that, because we don't want anybody to lose their home. We wouldn't wish that on anyone, because we know what that's like. We are merely asking for a relationship that should have happened to begin with, where we came to know each other, or will come to know each other as equals in the eyes of the Great Spirit and participants in this eternal spiritual ecosystem of relationship. So for us, reparations are not really about money or the returning of land, although there are treaties that have been signed between some tribes and the federal government. And treaties, according to our own Constitution, are the law of the land. No other law supersedes them. So they need to be honored, and those need to be dealt with in the courts. But beyond that, what we're really looking for is how can we live in right relationship with one another. So if a church or a diocese is interested in establishing a relationship with an indigenous tribe that is located close by, I would encourage that, but with a couple of caveats. One, do not inflict your own agenda on them. They're not going to be interested in your agenda or what you think is right for them. To begin with, they're probably not even going to trust you. So that would be the first step, is to work on developing trust. And they have good reason not to trust. So you're going to have to convince them why they should trust you. And that takes time. It might take your entire life. But it's worth it. So don't inflict your agenda on them. And the other thing to keep in mind is that they may not want a relationship with you. They may, especially a church. They may not want a relationship with a Christian church simply because of what the Christian church has done to indigenous people over the years. And that's understandable. So the thing to do if you want to live in right relationship with an indigenous tribe under those circumstances, if they don't want to have a relationship with you, is to stay away. Respect them and honor that. Honor the boundary that they have established. This happened in North Dakota, this approach, during Standing Rock, where the Episcopal Church on the Standing Rock Reservation heard about DAPL and the pipeline that was going through near the tribal land, and knew how the tribal council was responding to it. So the church went to the tribal council and said, we know about the pipeline, we know what your concern is, we want to stand with you. Tell us, how can we stand with you? And if you want us to stay out of it, we'll stay out of it. So they didn't go in there with their own agenda, their own sanctimonious agenda, trying to inflict it on them. And the result was the council invited them to stand with them. The church gave the council agency over the decision. And so that's really the way to approach it. So if they're not interested in a relationship, stay away. I'm not an expert on the 12 steps. But I believe there is one of the steps, I'm not sure which one, maybe it's the 5th step, where it calls upon the person who is becoming sober to make amends to people, to anybody that they may have damaged or hurt when they were using, unless to try to do so would cause more harm than good. Because very likely this is a person who has been traumatized by them. And so to try to make contact with that person and be in the same room with that person would trigger that trauma all over again and cause more problems. And I think the dominant society is in that same kind of position with regard to indigenous people. There are some instances where we just may need to respect that boundary and pursue other ways of working for reconciliation. Yes?
I'm thinking about the first part of your presentation where you talked about like the indigenous worldview is X and the Christian worldview is Y. But many people that we will be ministering to inhabit both those spaces. So what words of wisdom do you have for us who are going to be ordained people or leaders, lay leaders in the church in doing ministry alongside folks who are both of those things?
Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. And that means that Jesus Christ needs to be known and needs to be accessible to all people, regardless of their culture. And that means that there will be some differences in understanding who Jesus is. And they may be different from the traditional Judeo-based Christian understanding. When the early Christian missionaries came to indigenous people and started preaching the gospel and reading the gospel to them and telling them about this Jesus person, they didn't know the first century Jesus of Nazareth, the Palestinian Jew, but they did know who Christ was and is, because Christ figures were present in their own traditional teachings and origin myths. Someone who did the very same things or very similar things as Christ. So it's not like the missionaries were bringing anything to the indigenous people that they didn't already know about. They just didn't know it in the same way. And it would have been wonderful if at that point the missionaries decided, well, let's learn from each other. We'll tell you about our understanding of Christ, and we'd like to hear about your understanding of Christ. And how can our understandings, though they may be different in some ways, mutually enhance each other? I think that would have been enormous if that had happened. Unfortunately, it didn't, because the missionaries came with the agenda of colonization and white supremacy along with the gospel.
If I may ask,
Yeah.
for those of us who find this possibility enlivening, are there places now, people who are trying to have that sort of mutual exploration of Christ or the gospel in the world that you imagine could have happened? Are there people today that are writing about, exploring in conversation or in art, that flow of understanding?
Well, that is an area of some controversy among indigenous people, and I think as a result of the colonization and what the church has done, there are some who say that you cannot be authentically Christian and indigenous, both. You have to be one or the other. Vine Deloria Jr. said that. That was his feeling, that it was an impossibility to authentically be Christian and indigenous. We had to be one or the other, or something had to give in order to make that happen. Steve Charleston came along in his book, The Four Vision Quests of Jesus, which a number of you have read and are familiar with. And if you haven't read that book, I really encourage you to do so. The Four Vision Quests of Jesus by Steve Charleston shows how it is possible to authentically be both indigenous and Christian if you understand Jesus as the fulfillment of indigenous tradition and spirituality, so that Jesus becomes the native Messiah. A little different understanding of what the Jewish Messiah is, but Messiah nonetheless. And in doing so, also see how indigenous understandings of Jesus can enhance traditional Christian understandings. So I would recommend that book. There's another book, a less known book by Mary Cochran called Dakota Crossbearer. And it's the story of Harold Jones, who was the first indigenous bishop consecrated in the Episcopal Church, consecrated in 1972 as suffragan in South Dakota. Harold Jones, a Santee Sioux, struggled with the issues of how can you be indigenous and Christian when he was growing up in the early 20th century. And there's a wonderful narrative on how that can be accomplished through your own personal spiritual journey as indigenous people make it. So I would encourage that book as well, Dakota Crossbearer by Mary Cochran.
What other questions do you all have? Over here, Dean.
I was moved by your reflection that what does it mean to be a Christian indigenous person in the 21st century. Can you give us any insight into your
Yeah, the question is how can you be an authentic indigenous person living in the United States in the 21st century? And then you add Christian into the mix there, and it's even more complicated. And the answer to that is I'm still trying to figure it out. I am, honestly. I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever get there fully. I'm continually a work in progress. I think it has to do with recognizing the presence of Christ in all things. And I truly believe that Christ is present in all things, just waiting to be found, and maybe I'm not in the right place in my life to see Christ at any particular time, but Christ is still there. What is the old saying? When the student is ready, the teacher arrives. Sometimes I'm not ready because I have my own struggles and my own problems. But I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question or not. But that's my response. Is I'm still trying to figure it out.
We do have time for one more, Scott.
You mentioned that some of the things that General Convention and the church have done in the past. What more would you like to see General Convention and the Episcopal Church do moving forward in acknowledging some of the history?
Well, one of the issues that we're going to need to take a look at is I said earlier that most indigenous people don't live on reservations, which is true. Most indigenous people live in urban metropolitan areas all over the United States. The largest population of indigenous people in any one region right now is in Los Angeles. And I think the population is estimated to be about 250,000 indigenous people living in the LA metropolitan area. Not just the city itself, but the whole area there, that region. Guess how much money the Episcopal Church has appropriated for indigenous ministry in Los Angeles? Well, up until very recently, it was nothing. Now there's a very small nominal amount because there are some ministries that are starting to happen there. You see, our strategy for indigenous ministry is still a 19th century strategy where our block grant funding goes to places like North and South Dakota and Alaska and what has now become Navajo land. And they absolutely do have needs there. They need the financial support. But so do indigenous people who live in other areas, which is the majority of them. We haven't figured out yet how to reach out to those folks. We haven't even really had the conversations yet. So that's something that I would like to see General Convention take a look at, and Executive Council, because they're the powers in our church. They're the ones that determine what we do and don't.
Thank you very much for bringing us yourself and your message tonight.
You're welcome.
It's really good to be with you.
And
I think Lisa is going to take us to dessert.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hauff.
Kalamia. Thank you.
I want to briefly thank the Harvey Steering Committee, Terry Calanao, Luis Rivas, and Tina Matungu. Thank you so much for all your help. Thank you, Stephen, for being our faculty sponsor. And also thank you, Dean Kittredge, for making this a student-led endeavor. Finally, I want to lead us in prayer. This is an indigenous prayer, so the Lord be with you. God, our Creator, we ask that we have the wisdom and patience to listen to one another and to learn the many ways you call us to live life. Teach us the ways to live it that heal and renew, so that we may hand it on to generations to come, radiant with your goodness and glory. Amen. You are now invited to reception right back here.